Your eyelids are heavy. The dashboard clock reads 2:47 a.m. in pale green digits, and you've been driving for 6 hours straight. The coffee from the BP at Dubbo Wharf somewhere around Gilgandra, and now there's nothing left but willpower and the road. You wind down the window. The air that floods the cabin isn't cool, it's thick, warm, carrying the scent of eucalyptus. You breathe it in, letting it slap at your face. Anything to keep the fog from settling behind your eyes. Your thumb finds the radio dial. Static. More static. A fragment of country music that dissolves into white noise before you can catch the melody. You punch through the presets. Static, static. The ghost of a talkback caller complaining about interest rates. And then nothing again. You switch it off. And the silence is somehow worse. The headlights carve a tunnel through the darkness ahead. 2 yellow beams that illuminate perhaps 50 metres of bitumen before the black swallows everything whole. Beyond that cone of light, the world ceases to exist. You know the thick bush is out there, pressing close on either side. But you can't see it. You can only feel it. Thousands of square kilometres of scrub and cypress pine and ironbark. Sitting, watching. A road sign catches a light. Narrabri, 127 kilometres. Still well over an hour of this. This endless corridor and nothing. This black tunnel boring through the heart of New South Wales. You roll your shoulders, crack your neck, adjust your grip on the wheel. And your mind starts to drift to stories that you've heard. Things truckers talk about in servo car parks and roadhouse diners. An old woman with a shopping trolley, white hair like a halo, arms reaching out of the darkness. You shake your head. Stupid. You're tired, that's all. The mind plays tricks on an empty highway. But you can't stop thinking about it. Your eyes keep drifting to the edges of the headlight beam, to the boundary where light surrenders to shadow. And somewhere, a small voice whispers, "What if you see her?" The engine hums, the tyres eat the road. The Pilliga Forest holds its breath around you, and the night stretches on. Welcome to Struth, a podcast where we traverse the dusty back roads of Australia's most enduring mysteries. I'm your storyteller, and today we're heading deep into the Australian interior, to a place where the trees grow thick and the roads grow thin, where the stars are so bright they seem to press down on you like a weight, and where, for more than 30 years, travellers have reported encounters with a woman who should not exist. This is the story of the Pilliga Princess. Her real name was Clare Wibson. She was homeless, eccentric, a familiar figure to truckers who travelled the Newell Highway through the Pilliga Forests in northern New South Wales. For years they'd pass her on the road. Grey-haired woman in a fishing hat and an old army coat, pushing a shopping trolley filled with all of her worldly possessions. Walking day and night through some of the most isolated country on the continent. And then, on March the 20th, 1993, Clare Wibson was struck and killed by a truck on that same highway. The circumstances of her death were haunting enough, but what happened afterwards defies easy explanation. Since that fateful night in 1993, hundreds of travellers have reported seeing an elderly woman with white hair and a shopping trolley walking the Newell Highway through Pilliga Forest. Drivers unfamiliar with the legend have stopped in nearby towns to report an old woman on foot in the middle of nowhere, and locals have simply nodded, unsurprised. Some witnesses describe hitting a trolley on the road, only to find no damage and no wreckage, and others speak of a figure that appears in the headlights, arms outstretched, before vanishing into nothing. Is a Pilliga princess a ghost? A trick of exhausted minds on lonely roads? Or something else entirely? A story we tell ourselves about guilt and memory and the women we fail to protect. So join me, if you're game enough, as we drive deep into the Pilliga, where the boundary between the living and the dead grows thin, and where one woman's tragic end became an endless journey. Imagine a patch of bush the size of a small European country. More than 5,000 square kilometres of semi-arid woodland sprawling across the northwestern slopes of New South Wales. The Pilliga scrub, as locals call it, is the largest continuous native forest remaining on the western plains of the state. From above, it's a dark green smear on the map, a vast interruption in the golden brown patchwork of farmland and grazing country. But from ground level, it's something else entirely. The Newell Highway, Route 39, cuts through its wilderness like a surgical incision. Built in the 1960s as a greenfields road, meaning it carved a new path rather than following existing tracks, the highway runs ruler straight in places, curves gently in others, rising and falling with the subtle undulations of the terrain. For approximately 120 kilometres between Narrabri to the north and Coonabarabran to the south, the road passes through the heart of the Pilliga. 120 kilometres, 75 miles. There are no rest stops in that stretch, no petrol stations, no street lights. Bugger all mobile phone coverage. Just road and bush and darkness so complete that the stars seem close enough to touch. And the wildlife out there, God, the wildlife. Kangaroos, of course, are the primary hazard. Big red bastards that materialise from the scrub with no warning, bounding across the road on powerful hind legs, confused by the glare of the headlights. A collision with a large kangaroo at highway speed can kill a person as surely as hitting another vehicle. Their eyes reflect headlights in pairs of orange-yellow dots, sometimes visible along the roadside, sometimes not visible, until they're already well and truly in your path. And there are other animals too. Wombats waddle across the road like furry boulders, low and solid and capable of tearing the undercarriage from a car. Feral pigs root through the scrub, occasionally blundering out onto the bitumen. And during the day, snakes sun themselves on that warm asphalt, reluctant to yield right away to anything. Long-haul truckers know the Pilliga's dangerous intimately. They've developed unwritten rules for this stretch of road. Never stop once you've entered the bush, not for anything short of mechanical failure. Never start the crossing with less than half a tank of fuel. And never, ever assume that you're alone out there. The Gamilaroi people, traditional owners of the land, whose country stretches across the Pilliga and beyond, have their own relationship with this place. They speak of it with respect that borders on wariness. The Pilliga is spiritually significant, yes, but also spiritually dangerous. A place where the boundary between worlds grows thin. A place where travellers should know their business and attend to it quickly. Even before Clare Wibson ever walked these roads, the Pilliga had accumulated a reputation for strangeness. Travellers reported seeing the Min lights, which we covered in an earlier episode. Those mysterious glowing orbs that dance across the outback horizon, following vehicles for kilometres before vanishing without explanation. Yowie sightings too peppered local folklore, tales of ape-like creatures glimpsed between the trees. Those sceptics attributed those to misidentified animals or overactive imaginations. Vehicles were found abandoned on the roadside with no explanation. their occupants seemingly vanished into the scrub. Into this already haunted landscape came a woman who would become a legend. So who was Clare Wibson? This is, in many ways, the central mystery of the Pilliga princess story. Not the supernatural sightings that followed her death, but the entirely human question of how a woman came to be walking alone through one of Australia's most isolated stretches of bush, pushing a shopping trolley with no fixed address and no one waiting for arrival. The historical record is frustratingly thin. What we know comes primarily from the memories of truckers and locals who encountered her in the years before her death, and from the brief newspaper coverage that followed the accident. She was elderly. Accounts vary, but most place her in her 60s or older. She had grey hair that had gone white at some point, hair that witnesses consistently describe as wild, unkempt, framing her withered face. She wore a fishing hat most of the time, one of those wide-brimmed canvas affairs that farmers use to keep the sun off. Her coat was old army surplus, olive drab or khaki, depending on who you ask, worn thin at the elbows and missing buttons, but still serviceable for nights that could turn cold without warning. And beneath the coat, layers of indeterminate clothing, jumpers and shirts, and who knows what else. The accumulated wardrobe of someone who carried everything they owned. And the trolley. Always a trolley. Or, for our North American listeners, the shopping cart. It was a bog-standard supermarket shopping trolley, the kind you might steal from a Woolworths car park if you had nowhere else to keep your belongings. Clare had filled it with everything a person might need to survive on the road. Blankets, food, water containers, mysterious bundles wrapped in plastic bags, the accumulated detritus of a life lived between places. The trolley's wheels were never designed for bitumen highways and gravel shoulders, yet somehow it kept on rolling, kept carrying her forward. Truckers would pass her at all hours. Dawn runs heading north to Brisbane, late night hauls south towards Melbourne. It didn't seem to matter. There she'd be, walking the shoulder of the Newell Highway, pushing a trolley head down, legs moving in that steady rhythm of someone who's learned to cover ground without wasting energy. Some drivers slowed, called out, offered rides. She always declined. She didn't want assistance. She didn't want company. She wanted only to keep moving. But where had she come from? Where was she going? The answers, if she ever gave them, have been lost to time. Some sources suggest she may have been Aboriginal, though this cannot be confirmed with certainty. Others speculate she was simply one of the casualties of that particular era, the 1980s and early 1990s, when deinstitutionalisation policies emptied psychiatric hospitals across Australia, releasing people into communities that had no resources to properly support. The locals had given her that name, the Pilliga Princess, though whether the title was affectionate or mocking depended on who was using it. It had a slight fairy tale quality to it, this idea of a princess wandering her kingdom of scrub and cypress pine, sovereign of a realm where no one else wanted to live. Perhaps there was some kindness in the name, an acknowledgement of her dignity despite her circumstances. Or perhaps it was a cruel humour of people who couldn't understand why anyone would choose to live as she did. What we do know is this: Clare Wibson was a fixture of the Pilliga for years before her death. She walked its highways in summer heat and winter cold. She survived somehow, finding water, finding food, finding shelter from storms that could roll across that country with terrifying speed. She was in many ways part of the landscape, as much as the kangaroos and the cypress pines and the red dust that settled on everything. And then, on a late night, in March 1993, her journey ended. March 20 was a Saturday, Nothing in the historical record suggests it was anything other than an ordinary day in that part of the world. The sun rose over the Pilliga at its appointed hour, tracked across the pale blue sky and set in a blaze of orange and pink that no one photographed or particularly remarked upon. Darkness fell with an abruptness characteristic of inland Australia, the twilight lasting mere minutes before the stars emerged in their billions. The truck driver, whose name has been kept from public record, was heading south on the Newell Highway. He'd driven this route countless times before. He knew its rhythms, its hazards, its particular dangers after dark. His headlights cut through the blackness ahead, illuminating the white lines, the shoulder, the wall of scrub on either side. He knew about Clare Wibson. Most truckers who worked this route did. He had probably passed her before, noted her shuffling progress along the shoulder, maybe even raised a hand in greeting or simply kept his eyes forward and his foot steady on the accelerator. She was a fact of the road, nothing more. What happened next has been recorded in official statements, reported in newspapers, and passed down through the oral history of the trucking community. The driver saw her, saw the familiar figure in the fishing hat and army coat, saw the shopping trolley catching the light. But something was different this time. Instead of walking along the shoulder, as she always did, Clare was crossing the highway, and then she turned toward him. The driver's statement, as reported in the Daily Liberal and Central Western Daily, describes what followed in language that haunts anyone who reads it. She turned towards me, arms outstretched in a hugging-like gesture, and ran towards the truck. The last thing I saw was the white hair flaring out around her wild-eyed face, and the expression was one of manic glee. Manic glee. Try to hold those words in your mind. Try to reconcile them with everything we know about human behaviour, about self-preservation, about the desperate survival instinct that keeps even the most troubled among us clinging to life. Clare Wibson saw the truck bearing down on her, saw the headlights, heard the engine, felt the vibration of all those tons of metal hurtling through the darkness, and she ran toward it. Not away, toward, arms open, as if to embrace it. Clare Wibson was laid to rest in the Coonabarabran Lawn Cemetery, a modest facility on the outskirts of the town at the southern end of the Pilliga stretch. Her grave marker bears the name she'd acquired for life, Pilliga Princess. Someone paid for that marker. Someone thought she deserved to be remembered by the title that had defined her final years. And that, you might think, would be the end of the story. A sad footnote in the long catalogue of Australian road deaths. A cautionary tale perhaps about mental illness and homelessness and the people who fall through the cracks of our society. But the story of the Pilliga Princess was only beginning. The first reports came within months of Clare Wibson's death. Truckers pulling into roadhouses at Narrabri and Coonabarabran, their faces pale in the fluorescent light, their hands not quite steady as they wrapped them around coffee mugs. Stories told in low voices to other drivers, to servo attendants, to anyone who would listen without laughing. They'd seen something out there in the Pilliga, something that couldn't be there. An old woman walking the highway shoulder, grey hair streaming in the wind of passing vehicles. An army coat, shapeless and familiar. And always the shopping trolley. That rattling companion pushing along the bitumen at an hour when no human should be abroad. At first the stories were easily dismissed. Tired drivers seeing things. The power of suggestion after a well-known local figure's death. Kangaroos misidentified in the split second of a passing glance. Fog playing tricks on sleep-deprived mind. The explanations were ready-made and rational, and most people accepted them without question. But The sightings continued. They came from different sources at different times under different conditions. Long-haul truckers who'd driven the Newell for decades reported seeing the woman in places they knew she couldn't be, miles from any settlement, at hours when even the most dedicated pedestrian would have sought shelter. Tourists unfamiliar with the area, people who had never heard of Clare Wibson or the Pilliga Princess, stopped in towns along the highway to report an elderly woman walking alone in the middle of nowhere. Should they call someone? Was she in trouble? Did anyone know who she was? One driver, a veteran of the Newell who'd been running freight between Brisbane and Melbourne for 15 years. It was winter, he said, sometime around 2004. He'd left Narrabri just after midnight, the cab heater struggling against the cold seeping through the doors. About 40 kilometres into the bush, his headlights caught something on the shoulder. At first he thought it was a roo, that distinctive shape at the edge of the light, but it was upright, walking. He slowed instinctively, the way you do when something doesn't fit the pattern your brain expects. And that's when he saw her clearly. Elderly woman, white hair streaming behind her like a banner, pushing a shopping trolley along the gravel shoulder. She was wearing what looked like an old army coat. His first thought was practical. What's she doing out here? His second, I should stop, check if she needs help. But something held him back. Call it instinct. Call it the knowledge every trucker develops about when to get involved and when to keep moving. He passed her, watching in his mirrors as she receded into darkness. At the next servo, he mentioned it to the attendant. Old woman with a trolley walking through the Pilliga at 1 a.m. Someone should probably check on her. The attendant just nodded. Yeah, mate. That's the princess. She's been walking that road a long time. The driver called the police anyway when he got to Coonabarabran, gave them the location, described what he'd seen. The officer on the other end of the line listened patiently, took down the details, and then something that made the driver's skin prickle. Sir, the woman you're describing died in 1993. For more than a decade, the story of the Pilliga Princess remained largely confined to the communities that knew her. Truckers who worked the Newell, residents of the towns that bookended the forest, the scattered farmers and station hands who made their living in that unforgiving country. It was told around campfires and in roadhouse booths, passed from driver to driver in the strange fellowship of people who understand what it means to be alone on an empty road at 3 a.m. Then in 2006, the story found a wider audience. ABC Radio Overnights was, and remains, a lifeline for Australia's long-haul trucking community. Broadcasting through the small hours when most of the country sleeps, the program keeps drivers company on those endless stretches between cities, offering a bit of music, talk back, and the simple reassurance of a human voice in the darkness. On one particular night in 2006, the conversation turned to ghost stories, to things seen on lonely roads, to the Pilliga Princess. The switchboard lit up. One caller, identifying himself only as Bongo, shared an encounter so disturbing that it overshadowed even the princess sightings. His experience, he said, happened in 1978, 15 years before Clare Wibson's death. He'd been driving through the Pilliga late at night when his truck broke down. No mobile phones in those days, no way to call for help, so he had two choices. Stay with the truck until someone passed or start walking. He chose to walk. What he encountered in the forest that night, what he claimed followed him through the scrub, what he heard moving in the darkness just beyond his torch beam, what he saw when he finally allowed himself to look back, was never fully detailed on air. The host tried his best to draw it out of him, but Bongo's voice kept breaking, kept circling back to the same refrain. You don't understand what's out there. You don't understand what walks that forest. He said he made it to a psychiatric facility, though he couldn't quite remember the name clearly. He said it might have been demolished since then. The staff there, he claimed, had heard stories like this before from other drivers who'd broken down in the Pilliga, mechanically and mentally, from people who'd spent too long in that country after dark. The story quickly became controversial. Researchers noted that the hospital Bongo described didn't appear in any records. The details shifted when pressed. Some dismissed it entirely as an elaborate hoax, the kind of tall tale that gets taller with each telling. Others pointed out the trauma does strange things to memory, that perhaps Bongo had encountered something, whether supernatural or psychological, that his mind couldn't properly process or record. What no one disputed was the genuine terror in his voice. Whatever Bongo experienced or believed he experienced in the Pilliga in 1978 had marked him permanently. The princess, she's just walking, he said before hanging up. But there's other things out there too. Older things. Things that were there before the road, before the trucks, before any of us. And they don't like being disturbed. But the Pilliga Princess sightings needed no embellishment. They continued on their own, independent of any single witness's credibility. The internet age accelerated everything. In 2012, blogs and forums began aggregating accounts, creating digital repositories where witnesses could share their experiences. The story spread from specialised trucking communities to the broader Australian public, then internationally, as paranormal enthusiasts discovered this modern ghost story emerging from the Antipodes. In 2014, filmmaker Dame Millard released There's Something in the Pilliga, a horror movie inspired by the legends that had accumulated around the forest. The film brought cinematic treatment to the princess and the other strange phenomena reported in that region, introducing the story to audience who might never have heard of the Newell Highway or Coonabarra Brand, or the woman who once walked between them. And through it all, the sightings have continued. New witnesses came forward with fresh accounts. Tourists driving the Newell for the first time reported seeing something they couldn't explain. Locals nod and shrug and say, yes, that's her. That's the princess. She's still out there. So what do we make of this? What do we know? What can be verified? Clare Wibson was real. She lived. She walked those roads. And sadly, she died on March the 20th, 1993, struck by a truck while crossing the Newell Highway. Her grave exists in the Coonabarra Brand Lawn Cemetery, marked with the title she earned in life. These are facts, documented, confirmable. What we also know is that people continue to report seeing her. Not everyone, not every night, but consistently enough that the phenomenon cannot be dismissed as isolated delusion or internet fabrication. These witnesses include long-haul truckers with decades of experience, tourists with no prior knowledge of legend, and locals who've lived their entire lives in the region. Their accounts share common elements, despite coming from different times and circumstances. And then we enter more uncertain territory. The sceptical explanations are readily available, and they deserve serious consideration. The Newell Highway through the Pilliga is a punishing drive, especially at night. The monotony of the landscape, the absolute darkness, the hypnotic effect of white lines passing beneath headlights. These conditions are known to produce altered states of consciousness, even in alert, well-rested drivers. For someone fighting fatigue at 3 a.m, after hours of seeing nothing but road and forest, the mind may begin to create what the eyes cannot find. This phenomenon, sometimes called highway hypnosis or white line fever, is well documented. Drivers enter a trance-like state where they continue operating their vehicles, but their conscious awareness diminishes dramatically. In this state, the brain becomes susceptible to pareidolia, the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random stimuli. A shifting shadow becomes a figure. A glimpse of movement becomes a woman walking. The legend once known provides a template for these misperceptions, shaping ambiguous stimuli into the expected form. Furthermore, the power of suggestion cannot be underestimated. Once a place becomes known as haunted, every strange experience there gets interpreted through that lens. A kangaroo bounding across the road becomes a ghostly figure. A wisp of fog becomes streaming white hair. The shopping trolley sound, that distinctive rattle, might be nothing more than a loose cargo strap, reinterpreted by a primed imagination. And yet, the sightings began before the legend was widely known. Early witnesses in the months and years immediately following Clare's death had no framework for what they saw. They didn't know they were supposed to see a ghost with a shopping trolley. They simply saw what they saw and struggled to explain it. These accounts, arising independently from people with no connection to each other, share details that weren't yet part of public knowledge. The consistency is troubling for the skeptic. If these sightings were purely psychological, products of fatigue and suggestion, we'd expect more variation in the descriptions. But the white hair, the army coat, the fishing hat, the trolley, the outstretched arms, these elements recur with a fidelity that suggests either a common source or a common experience. And perhaps most unnervingly, some witnesses describe seeing the princess under conditions that should preclude hallucination. Alert drivers, early in their journeys not yet fatigued to encounter the figure, who have had time to observe it clearly before it vanishes. Passengers who see what the driver sees, ruling out individual delusion. People who stop their vehicles, get out, search for the woman they've just seen, and find nothing. What are we left with? The scientific materialist will say insufficient evidence for supernatural claims. The folklore scholar would say a textbook case of legend formation, of collective meaning-making in response to tragedy. The paranormal investigator might say a residual haunting, trauma imprinted on a landscape, repeating endlessly like a recording. The truckers who drive the Newell Highway have their own answer, which is simpler and perhaps more honest. Something's out there, don't know what it is, seen it myself. And then they finish their coffee, climb back into their rigs, and head into the Pilliga once more. Drive the Newell Highway through the Pilliga late enough at night, and you'll understand why the stories persist. The darkness out there is absolute. The isolation is complete. And somewhere in the back of your mind, no matter how firmly you cling to rationality, a small voice will continue to ask, what if? What if the headlights catch something they shouldn't? What if you see her? What if she reaches out to you, arms outstretched? Would you stop? Struth. Thanks for listening. If this journey through the Pilliga darkness kept you watching the roadside for shadows, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and make sure you tell a friend, anyone who likes a good yarn. If there's an Australian case you'd like me to cover, struthpodcast@gmail.com. You'll also find us on most of the socials, Struth Podcast. Next week we'll be staying in New South Wales, where in 1934 the badly burned body of a woman with a bullet through the neck was found in a culvert running under Howlong Road in Albury. The woman became known as the Pyjama Girl. Trust me, you don't want to miss this one. Make sure you subscribe. Until then, keep your tank full, your eyes open, and your mind prepared for whatever might step out of the darkness ahead. Because after all, on Australia's endless roads, you never know who you might meet. I'll catch you next time.